Hello everyone and welcome back to the NPC Dungeon. As promised, today's video is going to be all about how to start a D&D campaign. If you don't know, I'm continuing a series of DM advice that I started a few weeks ago, all about the beginning and end of a campaign. I already discussed session zeros and epilogue sessions, and next week I'm going to finish off this series with how I like to end a campaign. But for now, it's starting a campaign. It can be kind of scary since it sort of feels like you have to make something out of nothing, and without any kind of guide, it can be kind of hard to set the proper rhythm for yourself and for your group. In fact, this session is all about setting the rhythm and pace for the rest of the campaign. Obviously, you have to know what kind of rhythm and pace and themes work best for your kind of group and your kind of table, and as you might have guessed, a session zero is a good way of doing that. And like I already said, I released a video a couple weeks ago all about session zeros, so check that one out if you want to know more about that. And as I always say, since everyone's group is going to be a little bit different, not everything I say and really not everything anyone is going to say will apply to every group, but I think I've condensed 4 tips here that I think are pretty useful for new DMs when it comes to starting a campaign. More specifically, it's 4 parts that I think the first session of every campaign should have. They follow a very character-driven narrative flow and style. I already discussed why a character-driven style can boost player immersion and engagement in my second episode on immersion, in case you want to learn more about that. And these 4 tips are certainly things that I wish I took into account and knew to do when I first started. But that's enough introduction, so let's get started and let's learn something. Let's begin by keeping with today's theme and start from the beginning. The first actual part of a session that I begin with is probably one of the most character-driven parts, and this might just be a relic of my old style where I really only used backstory as a way to introduce the characters. Don't ask, it's a bad technique, don't do that, backstories are more than that. But what I do is, when I first begin a first session of a campaign, is that I zoom in on each character individually, or in groups in the case that any of my players might have a combined backstory, and allow them to have a little bit of time to roleplay before the session actually takes off. The idea is that you're establishing early on that the game that you're running is going to be character motivated and that you're immediately putting your players in the driver's seat. It also allows them a little bit of a grace period to kind of get into the world, get into character before anything too high stakes ends up happening. If you just throw them into combat immediately, they'll have no time to enjoy the game, slow down, and really just make sure they start off on the right foot. I mean, there are exceptions, but this is a general rule after all anyway. And that's great and all, but how do I do this? How do I find a way to bring everyone into the story? Well, this starts long before the first session. I encourage my players to have a backstory, and I discuss that backstory with them so that I can make sure that the story and their story are one of the same. Truthfully, I try not to even write too much about the story before I even have their backstories, but I also discuss their backstories with them so that I can know what would lead them into the story. Not only the answer to this question, but also the question itself depends hugely on what kind of campaign you are running. Do you need to know how they end up in the starting town where all the players get roped into the adventure? Do you need to know how they know a certain NPC who gets the ball rolling, so to speak? Do you need to know how they heard about a certain job? Whatever it is, and whatever your answers are and their answers are to this question, you can use this to make up what they're doing while you zoom in on them. Maybe they live in the starting city. Maybe they're meeting with the NPC that they know. Maybe this time is when they actually get the job they were assigned to do. And make sure that you use this stuff to actually give them stuff to do. Don't just describe them walking. Let them talk to NPCs and negotiate or whatever. And if you can't find anything to fill that time with, it doesn't have to be related to their story. I once had something like this happen, so I had this character have a run-in with a particularly creative band of pickpockets, and then have them talk to a very stuck-up theater manager about an audition for a local show. And of course, there are many ways of doing this. Let your players know the basics of how you intend to introduce them because you don't want to blindside them, and then have fun and be creative. And once you've done that, then you're ready to actually start bringing them all together. Now, the way that you bring them all together, much like how you bring them into the story, depends very much on the kind of campaign you're running. You may have them all happen to show up at the same tavern where they run into the same stereotypical hooded figure who gives them a quest. You can have them show up all at the job they were called to do simultaneously. You can even have them meet in some kind of disaster where they have to fight. You might even say they already know each other, so you can skip this part entirely if you want, if that's what you and your players want to do, that is. As a short little side note, speaking of what you and your players might want, you might even be able to do some kind of themed campaign where everyone is a certain thing. Maybe they're all bards who are in a band together. Maybe they're all rogues who fight from a certain thieves guild. This can spring naturally from character creation, or you and your players might organize this. If I'm being honest, I'm starting to lean more toward this style myself, but back to the matter at hand. The first thing that I want to say about this point is keep it simple. You could have some super convoluted beginning where one character needs to be rescued, one character is in disguise, and nothing is as it seems, but the beginning of an adventure, and of a campaign in general, should probably be the clearest part. And there's nothing wrong with using cliches here. They've been around for a long time for a reason. They work. And if they make your life easier as well as the lives of your players, then so be it. Your players don't have to stumble upon something in a super complex way. They can just be given the quest. And if you think that this might make it hard to use their backstories, that's a fair point to bring up, but luckily you still can. Think maybe someone in their backstory told them about the quest. Maybe something that comes up later on in a potential plot twist in the quest is related to where their character came from. And after you work all that out in your head and have this simple concept figured out, by the way, my very first DM advice video that I ever published was all about adventure hooks, and I talk all about keeping it simple there. Just if you want to check it out, please ignore the sound. It isn't the best. Then, once you have a simple concept in mind, you can, if you want, start working in little deviations from this cliche. Maybe your players don't meet in a tavern specifically, maybe it's an underground market or a circus. Maybe it isn't some fight that brings them together, maybe it's some kind of complex social encounter, and the list goes on. And for one final point that I want to make here before moving on, give your players some time to roleplay. Let them make introductions, let them talk about the job they're going to do, let them play and have fun. Not interrupting roleplay is actually a very important skill, and I mentioned it a little bit in my episode on new DM mistakes, how to avoid them if you're curious. But now that all of our players are together, we're ready to have some real fun. I like to have a bit of good first session combat to really kick things off. Of course, it doesn't have to be combat, it can really be any kind of intense encounter. First, you might have noticed how in my last point, I mentioned how you might use combat or really any other intense kind of encounter to bring your players together. Well, if you did that, you don't necessarily have to do so here. But if you want to, I would probably use a different kind of encounter for each, just to have a little bit of variety. You may have your players fight something as a way of bringing them together, and then have them undergo some kind of intense social encounter for this part. Now, you can hopefully see part of what I meant when I said that this is going to be different for every group and for every table, and even for every campaign too, I think. But what is this part? In other words, why do I think it's so important? Well, you might know that I think that group cohesion is super important, and so I like to use some kind of really difficult encounter that requires them to work together and kind of binds them together at that point. Your players may all know each other, but their characters just went through something of incredible difficulty together. If you spare me a metaphor, it's like using fire to weld them together and forge a lasting friendship. And hopefully these friendships become over the table friendships as well, if they're not already. This point actually built out the first thing we did, again, unless you want the coming together point to serve this purpose and not have a whole other part of your session one be devoted to it, in which case that point built out the first thing we did. And if you remember, the first thing we did was that we zoomed in on your players individually. The idea is that that part gets them immersed, and this part takes them while they are immersed and forces them to become invested in the hard, high-stakes encounter that you are putting them through. Quick word of warning, and this is true I think in any difficult or intense encounter, you need to know what kinds of things your players are and are not okay with, so that you don't make anyone uncomfortable. Everyone has their limits, and you don't want to overstep anyone's. Talk to them about this, and keep it in mind when you're planning these kinds of encounters. Your goal is not to scar your players, your goal is to give a challenging but fair experience in which everyone is welcome and everyone can have fun. Again, session zeros are a great way of doing this, and again, I direct you to my previous video about them. And lastly, when you do this, make sure you give them time to regroup afterward. Just like I said in my last point, you want to give them time to roleplay, but here it serves kind of a different role. Actually, it serves several roles. One very obvious one is that it gives your players time to heal and rest, but an even more important one is to let them have time to take stock and reflect. Just like I said in the first part where you zoom on your players, how can they be immersed if you're constantly rushing them ahead? And here specifically, it's important that they're able to communicate after this combat or whatever you give them, as this really secures that bond. The moment they start saying, "Is everyone okay?" is the moment they start caring about the other players, so that later on in the campaign when some huge plot twist affects one of the PCs, the others will be more likely to band together and help them out. And now finally, we are ready to move on with the story. Remember that thing your players were sent to do? The NPC they were told to contact or whatever you had them do? Well, now is the time to get it started. Here's where you introduce the NPC who sends them away, where they negotiate for the bounty they may collect, and where they head off. Ending it this way helps me to make sure the session ends on a satisfying note, and helps me have some direction for next time. But don't think that you have to be so cookie cutter. You don't have to use cliches. Feel free to mix and match and reorder parts of this template that I gave you, because that's all it is, a template. You can have the combat come after the beginning of the quest if you want. You can have a mini twist occur along the way. I just recently ran a first session like this, where the patron my players were sent to meet had vanished, and a mystery had unfolded for them to find this missing NPC. I actually just told this story recently when I talked about mysteries on this channel. And before we leave, let me summarize real quick, because I know this is a lot to take in. Here's my method. I like to zoom in on my players individually, giving them chances to exercise their agency and roleplay and immerse themselves into the game. Next, I bring them together. They all might be called to complete some job or just run into each other by some other fortuitous happenstance. And then I try to be sure to give them time to roleplay and make introductions missions here, one might even count that as a secret third point. But moving on, I then put them through their paces to solidify them as a group and give them time afterward to recuperate. That recuperation step could even be said to be its own point on its own as well if you like. And I also said that you could fully combine that gathering part with this one if you have them fight something when they meet. Now put this way, you can hopefully see how these 2 points parallel each other quite nicely. And lastly, I use whatever quest I intend to send them on to wrap up the session as they begin their journey. But that's just how I do it. Be sure to let me know how you do things in the comments, and be sure to check out this week's D&D Storytime video about a campaign that I began. I have to admit, it isn't the best example. My most recent campaign, the one I'm currently running that is, gives the best example of this, but I don't want to tell too much about that one just yet, as my players do watch this channel, and I don't want to give anything away about each other's backstories just yet. Even though, yes, this is the same one that I told the mystery story from that I recently told. Anyway, check back next Friday where I'll give some DM advice about how I like to end a campaign, and come back on Saturday where I'll continue the story series that I started a couple weeks ago. I was going to tell the story about how I ended the campaign that this week's story came from first, but I still feel like there are other stories from that campaign I'd rather tell first before I skip just to the end of it. Of course, thanks for watching. I hope this video was helpful. Until next time, let's learn something.